The Mafia boss panicked without an interpreter. Even the black Maid showed up. The grand ballroom of the Valentino estate was packed with some of the most powerful figures in the city, businessmen, politicians, and foreign diplomats, all gathered for a crucial summit that could shape the future of global trade. The Mafia boss, Dominic Valentino, stood at the center, his imposing figure radiating confidence as he prepared to address the crowd. But then it happened. He reached for his briefcase, only to realize, with a sinking feeling, that his interpreter was nowhere to be found. He had assumed they would be ready, but the last-minute cancellation had left him without anyone to help him navigate the delicate conversation ahead. His heart raced. As he turned to his assistant for guidance, he was met with blank stares. Without his interpreter, he would be at a severe disadvantage. This was not just a meeting. This was a crucial moment in his empire, and the stakes were too high for him to falter. Panic gripped him, but he tried to mask it with a calm demeanor, leaning forward to speak, his voice steady, though his mind was in turmoil. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. It was then that something unexpected happened. From the back of the room, a figure stepped forward. It was his maid, Angela. She was supposed to be cleaning up after the event, staying in the background, invisible to the important guests. But Angela, a woman who had worked in the mansion for years, had a secret. She wasn't just a maid. She had a sharp mind and had been fluent in several languages long before she'd started working for the Valentinos. She had been listening to the conversations all night, absorbing details, catching words and phrases that many would have missed. Dominic looked up, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. She hesitated, but then, with the courage she had rarely shown in front of him, she walked up to the front of the room. The eyes of the crowd followed her as she approached. She stood next to Dominic, who, in a moment of desperation, nodded for her to speak. Without a second thought, Angela began to translate, flawlessly. The room watched in awe as she handled the complex negotiations with the ease and confidence that Dominic had been lacking. The words flowed from her lips with precision, her voice clear and calm, and it wasn't long before the tension in the room began to dissipate. As she continued, Dominic felt something shift within him. He had always seen Angela as just an employee, someone who cleaned the floors and took care of small tasks. But now, she was his lifeline, saving him from a potentially disastrous situation. As the meeting progressed, the diplomats exchanged looks of admiration. They had not expected this woman to be the key to the meeting's success, but she was, and they could see it. The power dynamics in the room had subtly shifted. Dominic, once the unquestioned authority, now found himself looking at Angela in a new light. His respect for her grew in that moment, as did his realization that she was far more than he had ever given her credit for. The meeting went on without a hitch, and by the end of the night, Dominic was not only relieved but also deeply impressed. As the guests began to leave, he approached Angela in private, his voice softer than usual. "Thank you, Angela. I didn't know you were capable of that." Angela, her face still expressionless as always, simply nodded. "I do what I can to help, sir." And with that, she turned and walked away, back to the shadows of the mansion where she had always belonged. But in that moment, something had changed. She had proven herself, not just to Dominic, but to everyone in the room. The maid, the quiet observer, had stepped into the light and saved the day. After the successful meeting, where Angela, the maid, had come to his rescue with her flawless translation skills, Dominic Valentino found himself reflecting deeply on the events that had just unfolded. He had always prided himself on his control, his power, and the ability to navigate any situation with ease. But today, he had been reminded of his vulnerability, and it had come from an unexpected source. Angela, the woman who had cleaned his floors and kept his house in order for years, had saved him. The realization was a hard pill to swallow. He had underestimated her, just like everyone else in his world did. He had viewed her as nothing more than a servant, someone whose place was to stay out of the way, unseen and unheard. But today, she had shown him that there was more to her than met the eye. Dominic sat in his office that evening, long after the last guest had left the mansion. The city lights outside his window twinkled like a million stars, but his mind was still occupied with thoughts of Angela. He had never truly noticed her before, but now, as he sat alone with his thoughts, he couldn't help but think of the quiet confidence she had displayed. It had been a pivotal moment for him, one that had shattered the illusion of control he had worked so hard to maintain. Angela, on the other hand, had gone back to her usual duties. She had walked away from the meeting with the same calm demeanor she always carried, as if she had not just changed the course of a major event in the Valentino Empire. For her, it was just another day. As she cleaned the grand ballroom, she couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had done her job well, but it wasn't the first time she had used her knowledge to help in ways no one had expected. Over the years, Angela had been a silent observer of the Valentino household. She had seen things, overheard conversations, and understood the nuances of the world she was a part of. But she had never let anyone know what she was capable of. She kept her talents hidden, not out of fear, but out of respect for the boundaries that had been set by those in power. Yet today, something had shifted inside her. Helping Dominic had felt different, like she had finally stepped out of the shadows and into her own light. It wasn't about seeking recognition or power. It was about proving to herself that she was more than what others saw her as. Back in his office, Dominic stood up and walked over to the window. He stared out into the city, his thoughts swirling. His empire, built on years of hard work and ruthless ambition, had always been secure, but today, he realized that the foundation of it all had cracks. It wasn't just about money or influence. It was about people, and for the first time, he understood that the strength of his empire didn't lie solely in the power he wielded. It also rested on the people who made it all possible, people like Angela. He had always seen himself as untouchable, a man who controlled everything around him. But today, he had been shown that even the most powerful men had their limits. The door to his office opened quietly, and Angela stepped in, her expression unchanged as always. She stood there for a moment, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting for him to speak. Dominic turned to face her, his gaze more intense than it had ever been. "Angela," he said, his voice softer than usual, "I need to speak with you." Angela nodded and stepped forward. She had been anticipating this conversation, though she hadn't known when it would come. She wasn't sure what Dominic wanted from her, but she had no intentions of backing down. Dominic walked over to his desk, his hands resting on the polished surface as he looked at her. "What you did today," he paused, trying to find the right words. "You saved the meeting, saved me." Angela stood still, her eyes steady, as if she was waiting for him to say more. "I didn't realize," Dominic began, but then stopped himself. He took a deep breath and continued, "I didn't realize what you were capable of. I've always looked at you as just the maid, but you're much more than that." Angela tilted her head slightly, but said nothing. She wasn't looking for praise. She had done what needed to be done, and that was enough for her. Dominic paused again, the weight of his words sinking in. "You're different from what I thought," he said quietly. "I need someone like you on my team. Not as a maid, but as a real asset. A valuable member of this organization." Angela's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't respond immediately. She wasn't sure what this offer meant, but it was clear that Dominic was offering her something more than just a position. He was offering her a chance to change her place in the world, a chance to prove herself on her own terms. As she stood there, waiting for him to elaborate, she realized that this was a turning point. She had gone from being invisible to being seen for who she really was. And as she looked at Dominic, she knew that this was just the beginning of something far bigger than she could have ever imagined. After the unexpected turn of events, where Angela had saved the crucial meeting, the tension in the Valentino mansion lingered. Dominic Valentino sat at his desk, staring at the glowing city lights outside his window, deep in thought. The weight of the day had not yet left him. Angela, the maid, had not only spoken up, but had handled the situation with such poise and intelligence that it left him questioning everything he had ever assumed about her. The walls he had built around himself and his empire had always been unshakable, but Angela had shown him the cracks in his perception. He had underestimated her, and now he had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. Angela was far more than just a maid. As the evening wore on, Dominic found himself unable to shake the image of her standing in front of the crowd, effortlessly translating the complicated negotiations that had once seemed beyond his grasp. It was a pivotal moment, and for the first time in a long while, Dominic felt vulnerable. He had been the one in control of every situation, but today, his power had faltered, and it had been Angela who had saved him. Meanwhile, Angela had returned to her duties. As she moved through the mansion, cleaning and organizing, she couldn't help but replay the events of the day in her mind. It was strange to her, being recognized for something other than her work as a maid. She had never asked for anything more than to be left alone to do her job quietly. But today, she had been thrust into the spotlight, and something had changed inside her. She had always known that she was capable of more than what others saw in her. But until now, she had kept those skills hidden, not out of fear, but because of respect for the boundaries of her position. Now, with Dominic's words still echoing in her mind, she found herself wondering what it would mean to no longer be invisible. She had done the right thing today, and yet the quiet pride she felt wasn't the kind that came from seeking recognition. It was simply knowing that she had acted with integrity, that she had done what needed to be done. But as the night grew darker, the mansion felt emptier than ever. Her role here, once so clearly defined, had begun to feel uncertain. Back in his office, Dominic was still restless. He had thought of offering Angela a position within his organization, something far beyond what he had initially imagined for her. But now that the idea had taken root, he was unsure how to proceed. He had always been a man who took control, who made decisions with certainty. But with Angela, he found himself uncertain, wondering if he could truly offer her a place in his world without complicating the fragile balance that held everything together. He thought back to the moments during the meeting when Angela had stepped in to help. Her presence had not only resolved the crisis, but had also made him realize how much he had taken his own power for granted. He was a powerful man, yes, but without people like Angela, what was his empire really worth? Dominic was used to people fearing him, but Angela had never feared him. She had approached the situation with calm intelligence, without hesitation. That was the kind of person he needed, the kind of person he could trust, but also the kind of person who could challenge him. He stood up from his desk and walked to the door. He knew what he had to do. As he made his way through the mansion, he saw Angela, still working, still doing what she always did. She looked up as he approached, her expression as neutral as ever. "Angela," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "We need to talk." Angela nodded, setting down the cleaning supplies she had been holding. She wasn't sure what this conversation would be about, but she had a feeling it was going to change everything. Dominic motioned for her to follow him, and they walked together to a quiet part of the mansion, away from the noise of the house staff and the distractions of the night. He turned to face her, his eyes serious. "You've done something today that no one expected," he began. "You saved my empire from falling apart, and you did it with no hesitation. That means more than you know." Angela said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "I've realized that I've been wrong about you," Dominic said, his voice low. "I've been wrong about a lot of things, and I need to make things right." Angela's heart beat faster as she stood there, unsure of what he meant. Dominic paused, his gaze intense. "I want to offer you a new position, Angela. Not as a maid, but as something more. Something that reflects your intelligence, your capabilities. You've proven today that you're more than just someone who cleans this house. You're someone who can make decisions, who can help run this organization." Angela looked at him in surprise, unsure of how to respond. She had never imagined that Dominic would see her this way, let alone offer her a place within his empire. She had spent years in his house, silently observing, but always on the outside looking in. Now, she was being invited in. But did she want that? As she stood there, thinking about her options, she realized that this wasn't just about the position. It was about proving to herself that she was more than the role she had been given. It was about claiming her place in the world. "I'm not asking you to make a decision now," Dominic added, sensing her hesitation. "Take your time. But know this, you have a place here, with me, if you want it." Angela stood in silence for a moment, weighing the gravity of his words. She had never expected this day to unfold as it had. But now, with Dominic's offer on the table, she knew that her life was about to change. The following days were a blur of activity, but for Dominic Valentino, the weight of his decision hung over him like a dark cloud. Angela's presence in the mansion had become something he could no longer ignore, and every time he saw her, he couldn't help but remember the way she had saved him during the meeting. She was no longer just the maid, but someone with potential, someone whose intelligence and calm demeanor had proven invaluable. Dominic had already made up his mind. He would offer her a position, a real one, but not just any position. It would be one that gave her the power and respect she deserved. The idea of her in his world, the world of high-stakes business and crime, seemed foreign to him, but as he considered it more, it made perfect sense. He had been surrounded by yes-men for too long, people who were too afraid to challenge him, too afraid to tell him when he was wrong. Angela was different. He had seen it that day when she stepped in to translate, when she had done what no one else could do. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized that she was the type of person he needed in his corner. He just didn't know if she would accept his offer. Angela, on the other hand, was still processing what had happened. She had never expected to be seen as more than just a maid. For years, she had kept her head down, working quietly, observing everything around her, but never participating in the world of the powerful people who walked through the mansion's doors. She had always been content to stay in the background. But after the meeting, after Dominic's words, things had changed. It wasn't just about the position he had offered her. It was about the recognition, the acknowledgement that she was more than just a servant. It was about finally being seen for who she really was. Not just for what she did, but for her mind, her strength, her potential. Angela had been afraid of what would happen if she stepped out of her role, afraid of how people might see her if she ever dared to challenge the boundaries set by the world around her. But now, as she stood in the quiet of the mansion's hallway, thinking about what Dominic had said, she felt something stir inside her. The fear was still there, but it was beginning to fade, replaced by something stronger. Hope. The next morning, as the sun began to rise, Dominic stood on the balcony of his penthouse, looking out over the city. He had always prided himself on being a man of action, someone who made decisions quickly and decisively. But today, he felt a strange uncertainty. It wasn't about the business deals or the meetings he had lined up. It was about Angela. He had already decided to offer her the position, but as he thought about it more, he began to question if he was making the right choice. Would she accept? Would she even want to be a part of his world? Dominic knew the risks. Bringing Angela into his inner circle would change everything. It would be a shift in the balance of power. People would talk, but deep down, he knew it was the right thing to do. Angela was more than capable, and she deserved more than to be relegated to the shadows. As he turned from the balcony, he was met by his head of security, Luca. "Mr. Valentino," Luca said, his voice low. "There's someone here to see you." Dominic raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Luca hesitated for a moment. "It's Angela, sir." Dominic's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting to speak with her soon, but he hadn't anticipated it would happen so quickly. "Send her in," Dominic said, his voice calm but tinged with anticipation. A moment later, Angela entered the room. She stood tall, her posture confident but still tinged with the humility that had always defined her. Dominic studied her for a moment, unsure of what to expect. Angela met his gaze, her eyes steady and unwavering. "You wanted to speak with me, Mr. Valentino?" she asked, her voice calm, but with an underlying strength. "Yes," Dominic replied, his tone softer than usual. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened the other day. About what you did. You saved that meeting, Angela. You saved me." Angela said nothing, but the faintest hint of a smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "I did what needed to be done," she replied simply. Dominic nodded. "And that's why I want to offer you something more. I want you to join my team, Angela. Not as a maid, but as an advisor. Someone who can help guide me. Someone who can challenge me when I'm wrong." Angela's eyes widened in surprise, but she said nothing. Dominic continued, his voice firm. "I can't promise it will be easy, but I can promise it will be real. You'll have a place here, with me, if you want it. But I need to know if you're willing to take that step. To leave your old role behind and step into something bigger." The silence between them was thick with tension, but for the first time in a long time, Dominic felt uncertain. He had made his offer, but now he had to wait. Angela took a deep breath, her mind racing. This was more than just a job offer. This was a chance to change her life, to prove that she was more than what she had always been told she was. She had always believed in herself, but now, with Dominic's offer on the table, she realized that her future was in her hands. Slowly, she nodded. "I'll accept, Mr. Valentino. I'll do it." Dominic's face softened with a rare smile. "Good. Welcome to the team, Angela." As she left his office, Angela felt a sense of calm settle over her. She had made the choice. She had taken the first step into a new world, one that was filled with challenges, but also with opportunities. And for the first time, She felt like she was in control of her own destiny. The days following Angela's decision to accept Dominic's offer were filled with a sense of unease, both for her and for him. For Angela, stepping into the role of advisor to the Mafia boss was a move that she never could have imagined just weeks ago. She had always been content in her quiet, unseen place. But now, as the weight of her new role began to settle in, she couldn't help but feel the gravity of what she had agreed to. Every step she took within the mansion felt different, more deliberate. She was no longer just the woman who cleaned the floors and served meals. She was someone with power, with influence, and the reality of that change was still sinking in. Dominic, on the other hand, was also feeling the unfamiliar tension of having Angela in his inner circle. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who followed his orders without question, but now, with Angela in a position to challenge him, he found himself both excited and unsettled. He had always valued strength, but he had never had someone so close to him who could challenge him in such an intellectual way. The days ahead would be a test, not just of Angela's abilities, but of Dominic's ability to let go of control and allow someone else to have a voice in his empire. Angela's first task was to attend a business meeting with Dominic. It was a high-stakes negotiation involving several of the city's most influential business figures. As Dominic's right-hand person, Angela would be expected to offer insights, to speak up when needed, and to make decisions that would impact the future of the organization. The morning of the meeting, Angela stood before the full-length mirror in her room, adjusting her outfit. She had chosen a simple yet elegant black dress, professional but understated. As she fixed her hair, she took a deep breath, reminding herself that this was the moment she had been preparing for her whole life. This wasn't just a job. It was an opportunity to prove to herself and to everyone around her that she was capable of far more than anyone had ever thought. As she walked into the meeting room, she could feel the weight of every eye on her. The men at the table, dressed in expensive suits and carrying an air of arrogance, turned their heads as she entered. They weren't used to seeing a woman, let alone a woman of her position, in a place like this. Dominic, sitting at the head of the table, gave her a slight nod, signaling her to take a seat beside him. The room fell into a heavy silence as the meeting began, the tension palpable. The negotiations were intense, with each side pushing for their own interests, but Angela remained calm. As the discussions went on, she observed the room, listening carefully to the words being exchanged, watching the body language of each person at the table. When the time came for her to speak, she did so with confidence. Her words were clear, precise, and, most importantly, well-informed. The room was quiet as they listened to her, and for the first time, the men around the table realized that she wasn't just a secretary or a maid. She was an equal, a force to be reckoned with. Dominic watched her closely, his eyes narrowed in thought. He was impressed, not only by how well she understood the business, but also by how easily she commanded the room. She was more than capable. She was already proving herself to be an invaluable asset. By the end of the meeting, the deal had been sealed, and it was clear that Angela had played a key role in the outcome. As the men filed out of the room, Dominic remained seated, watching Angela as she gathered her notes. She looked up at him, her face calm, her expression unreadable. "You did well," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Better than I expected." Angela simply nodded, her face betraying no emotion. "Thank you, sir." Dominic stood up and walked over to her, his gaze steady. "I wasn't wrong about you," he said, his voice lower now. "You're more than just someone who cleans the house. You've got something special, Angela." Angela met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that she had finally found a place where she truly belonged, a place where she could make a difference. But deep down, she knew that this was just the beginning. There was still much to prove. Over the next few weeks, Angela's role in the organization continued to grow. She attended more meetings, offered more insights, and began to gain the trust of not only Dominic, but also the other key figures in his empire. But as her influence increased, so did the challenges. She was constantly tested, constantly faced with situations where she had to prove that she belonged in this world. There were moments of doubt, times when she questioned whether she had made the right decision, but each time, she pushed through. She had worked too hard to get here to turn back now. Dominic, for his part, continued to watch her closely. He admired her strength, her intellect, and the way she never backed down from a challenge. But as much as he valued her abilities, he couldn't help but wonder if he was making a mistake by allowing her so close to him. Could he truly trust her? Would she remain loyal, or would she one day decide that she was powerful enough to take on the empire herself? Only time would tell. But for now, Angela had proven herself, and Dominic knew that the days ahead would only become more complicated as their relationship continued to evolve. The balance of power had shifted, and neither of them knew where it would lead. As the weeks passed, Angela found herself settling into her new role with Dominic Valentino's organization. She was no longer just a quiet maid who kept to the shadows. She was an integral part of the operation, trusted and respected, not just by Dominic, but by the other key players in his world. The respect she had earned, however, did not come without its challenges. Every decision she made, every meeting she attended, she felt the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. Her every word, her every move was scrutinized. Some of the men in the organization still saw her as an outsider, a woman, who had no place in a world dominated by powerful men. They doubted her, whispered behind her back, and tried to test her. But Angela had long ago learned how to navigate a world of doubt and suspicion. She had spent years being underestimated, overlooked, and silenced. Now, it was her turn to prove that she was more than capable. As she sat across from Dominic one evening, discussing a major deal that could bring in millions of dollars, she couldn't help but notice how much had changed in the short time since she had first stepped into this world. Dominic, the man who had once looked at her as nothing more than a maid, was now turning to her for advice, for direction. He had come to trust her, and that trust had opened doors for her that she never could have imagined. But despite this newfound trust, Dominic had remained distant. He had offered her a position of power, but he still kept a part of himself closed off. Angela knew that something was holding him back, something he wasn't ready to reveal. She had caught glimpses of it, the vulnerability that lurked beneath his tough exterior. But she also knew that it wasn't her place to push. She had earned her position, but she hadn't earned his full trust yet. That night, as they finalized the details of the deal, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that Dominic was testing her, holding back just to see how far she would go. His eyes, usually filled with confidence and control, seemed guarded. He spoke to her with respect, but there was something else there, a flicker of doubt, perhaps, or something deeper, something more personal. After the meeting, as they left the room together, Angela felt a strange sense of unease. Dominic was still not the man she had hoped to understand. He was more than just the Mafia boss, more than the calculating businessman who always had the upper hand. He had moments of vulnerability, moments when he seemed like a man lost in his own empire. But it was always fleeting, always hidden behind that cold, confident exterior. Later that night, as Angela walked the mansion's corridors, she passed a mirror and paused to look at her reflection. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She had come so far, from cleaning the floors to sitting at the table with the most powerful people in the city. Yet, there was still a part of her that wondered if she truly belonged in this world. Had she earned it? Or was she simply playing a part, waiting for the moment when someone would expose her for what she truly was? Just a maid who had gotten too far? She shook her head, dismissing the thought. She had worked hard for everything she had, and she wasn't about to let doubt take that away from her. The next morning, as Angela arrived at the office, she found Dominic waiting for her. He was already at his desk, his usual cool demeanor in place. But today, there was something different about him. He wasn't focused on business. He was staring at the city skyline, lost in thought. Angela approached his desk cautiously, unsure of what to expect. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, her voice steady. Dominic turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that caught her off guard. "Yes," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking." He paused, as if weighing his words carefully. "I've been thinking about you. About this situation we're in." Angela raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Dominic leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "You've proven yourself time and time again. You've earned your place here, Angela. But there's something I need to say." Angela's heart beat faster. What was he getting at? "What is it?" she asked. Dominic hesitated, clearly wrestling with something inside him. "I've never had someone like you in my life," he said quietly. "Someone who can see things differently, someone who can challenge me." I've never let anyone close enough to do that. But you've earned my trust. Angela's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to say that. I'm not sure I fully understand, she said, her voice betraying a hint of uncertainty. Dominic's eyes softened as he looked at her. I know, and I don't expect you to understand everything right now. But I'm asking you to stay. Stay with me, stay in this position, and let me see if we can do something real together. The weight of his words settled in the air between them. Angela stood still, her mind racing. What was he asking? Was this just about business, or was there something more to it? She had worked so hard to earn his trust, to prove herself, but now, Dominic was offering her something far more valuable than any position in his empire. He was offering her a chance to be part of something bigger, something that went beyond the power, beyond the deals and the money. She thought about it for a long moment, her heart pounding in her chest. Finally, she spoke. I'll stay, she said, her voice steady. But on my terms. I'm not just here to work for you, Dominic. I'm here to work with you. If we're going to make this work, it has to be equal. Dominic looked at her, his gaze unreadable. After a long pause, he nodded. Agreed. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted once more. Angela had proven she was no longer just the maid, and Dominic had begun to realize that the true strength of his empire lay not in control, but in trust and partnership. Days turned into weeks, and as Angela settled further into her new role, the weight of her position within Dominic Valentino's empire became more apparent. She had not only gained Dominic's trust, but also the respect of the entire organization. Her decisions were beginning to shape the future of the business, and her voice was heard in the most critical meetings. Yet, as much as things had changed for Angela, there remained a tension between her and Dominic. The distance that had once existed between them was still there, though now it was subtle, a quiet undercurrent that neither of them could fully ignore. It wasn't that Dominic had grown cold toward her. On the contrary, he valued her insight more than he had ever imagined. But the moment he had offered her the position, he had unknowingly placed an invisible wall between them. Angela was no longer just an employee, no longer just someone who cleaned the floors and carried out orders. She was now a part of his world, a world of power, of danger, of decisions that could shape lives. And that change was something Dominic had not fully prepared for. Angela felt the shift, too. She could sense it in the way he looked at her now, in the way his gestures were more measured when she was around. She had seen him as the man who ran everything, the man with ultimate power, but now, she was seeing him in a different light. Dominic had let her in, but she was still not sure if he was ready to fully trust her, not just in business, but in everything. They were partners, yes, but a part of him still held back, as though he feared that letting her into his inner world completely would somehow compromise everything he had built. Angela was no stranger to power dynamics, but she had never been in a position like this before. She had fought for every inch of respect she had earned, and while the position she now held was a dream come true, it came with its own set of challenges. She wasn't just dealing with Dominic's empire. She was dealing with his personal demons, his carefully guarded secrets, and she couldn't help but wonder if he was hiding something from her. One evening, after a particularly grueling meeting with a rival family, Dominic stood at his window, staring out at the dark skyline of the city. Angela watched him from across the room, sensing the tension in his posture. The weight of his role was clearly beginning to wear on him, and the cracks in his composure were starting to show. She knew him better now than she had before, and she could see that he was struggling with something, though he had yet to share it with her. Finally, after a long silence, Dominic turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes, something that told Angela he was ready to speak, ready to finally address the unspoken tension between them. Angela, he said quietly, his voice low, I've been thinking. She stood up, walking toward him slowly. She had a feeling she knew where this was going. About what? She asked, her voice steady, though her heart raced with anticipation. Dominic hesitated for a moment, and when he spoke again, his words were measured, as if he were choosing them carefully. About us, he said. About what this has become. About you and me. Angela's breath caught in her throat. She had known that this conversation would come eventually, but hearing it out loud felt different. What do you mean? She asked, her voice softer now. Dominic stepped closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. I've always been a man of control, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've never let anyone get too close, never let anyone challenge my decisions. But with you, it's different. You challenge me in ways I've never been challenged before, and I'm not sure how to handle it. Angela looked at him, her heart beating faster. She had known for some time that their dynamic was shifting, but hearing him admit it was a shock. You don't have to handle it, she said quietly. I'm not here to change you. I'm here to work with you, to help you. Dominic's gaze softened, and for the first time in a long while, Angela saw the vulnerability in his eyes. I know, he said quietly, but it's not just that. I'm not used to letting anyone in, Angela. I've built my empire alone, and I've done everything to keep it that way. I've kept everyone at arm's length, and now I've let you in, and I don't know if I can fully trust myself with that. Angela felt a rush of empathy for him. She had always seen him as the powerful Mafia boss, the man who had everything under control, but now she saw the weight of the isolation he had carried all these years. He wasn't just a ruthless businessman. He was a man who had built walls around himself to protect his heart. She stepped closer to him, her voice gentle. Dominic, she said softly, you don't have to be alone anymore. You've let me in, and I'm here to stay. We can build this together. But you have to trust me, trust us. He looked at her, his expression conflicted. For a long moment, there was only silence between them, the weight of his thoughts hanging in the air. Finally, he nodded, the smallest of movements, but it was enough. I'll try, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll try to trust you. Angela smiled slightly, feeling the tension between them begin to ease. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As the evening wore on, Dominic and Angela stood side by side, looking out at the city together. For the first time, they both felt a shift in the balance of power, not just in the business, but in their relationship. They were no longer just boss and employee. They were something more, something that neither of them had fully understood until that moment. And as the night stretched on, Angela realized that this was just the beginning. They had both taken a step towards something greater, something that neither of them could have predicted. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, but they would do so as equals, partners in every sense of the word. The weeks that followed Dominic's admission to Angela marked a significant turning point for both of them. Their professional relationship began to evolve into something deeper, more complicated, but also more rewarding. They became partners, not just in the business sense, but in a way that neither of them had anticipated. Dominic, who had always been a solitary figure, found himself relying on Angela in ways he had never done with anyone else. She was sharp, intuitive, and as much as it had taken him time to trust her, she was becoming an indispensable part of his inner circle. But even with the progress they had made, there was still a tension, a subtle undercurrent of doubt that neither of them could fully shake off. For Angela, the change in her role had not been without its own set of challenges. She had gone from being the invisible maid to being a trusted advisor in Dominic's world, and it felt both empowering and isolating. She had worked so hard for everything she had, but at times, the weight of it all felt overwhelming. She wasn't used to the constant scrutiny, the high stakes of the decisions she was now making. There were moments when she would catch herself questioning if she truly belonged in this world, if she was really ready for the responsibility that had been thrust upon her. She knew she was capable, but the doubts still lingered in the back of her mind. One evening, after a long day of negotiations and tense meetings, Angela sat in the library of the mansion, the soft light of the desk lamp casting a warm glow over the room. She had been working on a new proposal for a partnership that would solidify their position in the market. Dominic had been preoccupied with other matters, but Angela knew that this deal was important, not just for the business, but for the trust that was still growing between them. She had spent hours poring over the details, ensuring that every point was in place, every risk mitigated. As she finished her work and prepared to head home for the night, she heard a soft knock at the door. She looked up to see Dominic standing in the doorway, his usual composed demeanor giving way to something more uncertain. Angela, he said, his voice unusually soft. Can we talk? She nodded, closing her laptop and gesturing for him to enter. He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the space for a moment before settling on her. There was something in his expression, a flicker of something he hadn't shared before. Angela couldn't place it, but it made her heart race. Of course, she said, trying to keep her tone calm. What's on your mind? Dominic took a deep breath before speaking, his voice low. I've been thinking about how things have changed between us, he said. How I've relied on you, trusted you. And I've been questioning whether I've done enough to make you feel secure in your position. Angela's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this conversation, especially after everything they had been through. What do you mean? She asked, her voice gentle, but with a hint of concern. Dominic paused, then took a step closer. I know you've been dealing with a lot of pressure lately, he said. The trust is there, but I realize I haven't always shown you the same respect that you've shown me. You've earned your place here, and I need to do more to make sure you feel like you belong. Angela blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected him to be so open, so vulnerable. Dominic, she began, but he raised his hand to stop her. No, let me finish, he said. I've been thinking about all the times I've kept you at arm's length, and I can't keep doing that. You've proven yourself time and time again, and I can't keep treating you like someone who's just here to clean up the messes. His words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, there was silence. Angela didn't know how to respond. She had worked so hard to get to this point, but hearing him say that made everything feel more real, more intimate. I just don't want you to feel like you have to prove anything to me, Dominic continued. You're here because I want you here, not because I think you owe me something. And I think it's time I show you that, fully. Angela could feel her pulse quicken as his words sank in. She had known Dominic for so long, had seen the layers beneath his cold exterior. But this was different. This wasn't just business. This was something personal. She had fought for so long to be seen, to prove her worth, but now Dominic was offering her something more, something that went beyond the empire they had built together. He was offering her something that could change everything. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice steady. I didn't know how much I needed to hear that until now. Dominic gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. I'm glad you heard it. For the first time in a long while, there was no tension between them, no unspoken barriers. They were two people, not just boss and employee, but partners, standing together as equals. As they stood there, the weight of their words settling between them, Angela realized that this was a moment of transformation. They had both come so far, and yet there was still so much more to come. Their journey was far from over, but in that moment, they knew they were on the same path, together. And for the first time, Angela felt truly seen, not just for her abilities or her intelligence, but for who she was as a person. She had earned her place, and Dominic had finally recognized it. But more than that, he had given her a place in his world, a place where she could stand beside him, not behind him. It was a partnership, and it was theirs to build. Days passed, and the bond between Angela and Dominic continued to grow stronger, both professionally and personally. They had crossed a line, not just as employer and employee, but as two individuals who had come to rely on each other in ways neither had anticipated. Dominic had begun to trust Angela not just with his business, but with his thoughts, his doubts, and his fears. For the first time in years, he found himself confiding in someone, allowing himself to be vulnerable in a way he had never done before. Angela, for her part, had become more than just the trusted advisor she had once been. She had become the person who kept Dominic grounded, who challenged him when necessary, and who stood by him through every decision, no matter how difficult. But as their relationship evolved, so did the challenges that came with it. Angela had learned how to navigate the ruthless world of power and influence, but now, her position had drawn the attention of others, some who saw her as a threat, and some who saw her as a tool to be used in the dangerous games that were constantly being played around them. One evening, as Angela reviewed a stack of documents in her office, she heard a knock at the door. It was Dominic, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, as he stepped into the room. Angela stood up, sensing the urgency in his tone. "What's going on?" she asked, her mind already racing with possibilities. Dominic closed the door behind him and leaned against it, his eyes meeting hers with a seriousness that made her heart skip a beat. "There's something I haven't told you," he said, his voice tight. "Something I've been keeping from you." Angela's pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of his words, and for a moment, she wondered if the trust they had built together was about to crumble. "What is it?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease she felt. Dominic hesitated for a moment, as if gathering the strength to speak. There are people in this organization who are not happy with the way things are going. People who don't like the influence you've gained. They see you as a threat, and they'll do anything to get rid of you. The words hit Angela like a punch to the stomach. She had known that her position was precarious, that not everyone would be thrilled with her rise to power, but hearing Dominic say it aloud made it all too real. Who? She asked, trying to keep her voice calm, though inside, she was filled with a mix of anger and fear. Dominic sighed and ran a hand through his hair. I can't say for sure, but I know that some of the people closest to me are already plotting against you. They're trying to use my trust in you to their advantage, to turn me against you. Angela's mind raced. She had always known that power came with a price, but now she was seeing the full extent of it. There were enemies within, people she had once considered allies, now seeing her as a threat to their own power. What do we do? She asked, her voice low, but determined. Dominic's gaze softened, and he stepped closer to her. We fight back, he said quietly. Together. I've made a lot of enemies over the years, Angela, and I know how dangerous they can be. But I also know that you're not someone who runs from a fight. We'll make sure they understand that we're a team. Angela nodded, a sense of resolve settling over her. She had never been one to back down from a challenge, and this was no different. If anything, the danger only made her more determined to prove herself. We'll need to be smart, she said. We can't let them see us coming. Dominic gave her a small smile, his respect for her growing by the second. That's why I need you, he said. We'll outsmart them, Angela. We'll stay one step ahead. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Dominic and Angela met in secret, carefully planning their next moves. They knew that they couldn't trust anyone, not even those who had been with Dominic for years. The walls had been closing in on them, and they needed to strike first. Angela had always been good at reading people, and she quickly pinpointed the individuals who posed the greatest threat. She began gathering information, working behind the scenes to expose the weaknesses of those who would try to undermine them. As they prepared for their next move, Dominic couldn't help but admire Angela's resolve. She was fearless, but it was more than that. She had a sharp mind, one that could think 5 steps ahead, and it was that intelligence that would carry them through the storm that was coming. But even as they worked together, Dominic knew that things could never go back to the way they were. The trust they had built was real, but the dangers they faced were real, too. Angela had stepped into his world, and now, there was no turning back. They were in this together, for better or for worse. And for the first time, in a long while, Dominic felt a sense of clarity. This was the woman who could stand beside him, not just in the business, but in everything that came with it. The fight was far from over, but with Angela by his side, he knew that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The game had changed, and they were ready to play. The tension in the Valentino mansion had reached its peak. After weeks of careful planning and strategizing, Dominic and Angela found themselves on the verge of a major confrontation. The rivals who had been silently plotting against them were making their move, and every decision now carried the weight of not just business success, but their very survival. Angela had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, gathering intelligence, analyzing every move their enemies had made. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that the stakes were higher than she had initially thought. The people closest to Dominic, those he had trusted for years, were the very ones trying to undermine him. They were playing a dangerous game, and Angela knew that they had to act fast, or they would lose everything. Dominic, too, had been feeling the pressure. He had always been a man who thrived under stress, but now, with the people he considered family turning on him, he felt the weight of his decisions more than ever. As much as he had tried to protect Angela from the darker side of his world, he knew that it was impossible to shield her from the storm that was coming. She was in this with him now, and they had to face the consequences together. The night before their planned strike, Dominic sat in his office, staring out at the city below. His mind was racing with thoughts of the future, of the risks they were about to take. Angela had become his closest ally, the one person who had proved herself capable of handling the complexities of his world. But as he thought about what was to come, a deep sense of unease settled over him. What if he was asking too much of her? What if she wasn't ready for the full weight of what lay ahead? He shook the thoughts away. Angela had already shown that she was more than capable. She had earned her place beside him, and he wasn't about to back down now. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Angela. She entered the room with the same calm, composed demeanor she always carried, but there was something different in her eyes. Dominic could see the determination in her gaze, the same fire that had sparked in her the moment she first stepped into his world. "We're ready," she said quietly. "Tomorrow we strike." Dominic stood up and walked over to her, his gaze fixed on hers. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. "There's no turning back once we make our move." Angela met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm sure," she said firmly. "We've come too far to back down now." Dominic looked at her for a long moment, his mind weighing the risks, but in the end, he knew there was no other choice. "Then we do this together," he said, his voice steady. "No more secrets. No more games. We take control." The next day, they moved quickly and decisively. The rivals who had been plotting against them didn't see it coming. Angela had been instrumental in gathering the right intel, and now they were using it to their advantage. Every move had been calculated, every step planned out with precision. By the time their enemies realized what was happening, it was too late. The balance of power had shifted. Dominic's empire was stronger than ever, and those who had tried to betray him were left scrambling. Their plans unraveled before they could even take root. As the dust settled and the dust of their enemies' defeat settled, Dominic looked at Angela with a deep sense of admiration. He had known that she was capable, but seeing her in action, working alongside him as an equal, had confirmed what he had always suspected. She was not just an asset to his empire, she was the key to its future. "You did it," Dominic said, his voice filled with respect. Angela nodded, a small, satisfied smile on her face. "We did it," she corrected him. "Together." In the days that followed, Dominic and Angela solidified their position, not just in the business world, but in each other's lives. Their partnership had been tested, and it had come out stronger than ever. Dominic no longer saw Angela as just a trusted advisor. She was his equal, his partner in every sense of the word. And Angela, for the first time, felt truly at home in Dominic's world, not just as someone who had earned her place, but as someone who had earned the right to stand by his side. Their bond, forged in the fire of challenges and betrayal, was unbreakable. And together, they would face whatever challenges came their way, knowing that as long as they had each other, nothing could stand in their way. The aftermath of their victory was far from peaceful. Dominic and Angela had successfully outmaneuvered their rivals, but the cost of their victory was becoming apparent. Though their enemies had been dealt with, the void they left behind was just as dangerous. The power vacuum within the organization had created a ripple effect, and there were new threats emerging from places Dominic had once trusted. Angela had proven herself capable, more than capable, in the eyes of Dominic and his empire. But now, she faced a different challenge, one that came not from the outside world, but from within. Dominic's trust in her had been earned, but it also made her a target for those who felt her rise was too quick, too bold. As she walked through the grand corridors of the Valentino mansion, she could feel the weight of the watchful eyes on her. The whispers in the hallways, the glances that shifted when she passed. She was no longer just an invisible figure in the background. She was now the center of attention, and with that attention came both admiration and resentment. But Angela had learned long ago how to navigate the shadows. She had spent years observing, listening, and waiting for the right moment to make her move. Now, the time had come to prove once again that she belonged. It was late one evening when Dominic called her into his office. The light from his desk lamp cast long shadows across the room as he looked up from a pile of documents. His face, though still as composed as ever, carried a weariness that hadn't been there before. "Angela," he began, his voice carrying the weight of his thoughts. "I need your help. There are things I can't handle alone anymore. The organization is changing, and I don't know who I can trust anymore." Angela nodded, a sense of understanding settling in. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, ready to take the next step, to prove once again that she was the partner he needed. Dominic hesitated for a moment, the vulnerability in his eyes growing clearer. "I need you to help me clean up what's left behind. The people who are still loyal to me are in hiding, uncertain of where they stand. The ones who aren't loyal, they need to be dealt with." Angela stood still for a moment, absorbing the weight of his request. She had always been willing to fight, but now the stakes were higher. There was no turning back. "We'll do this carefully," she said, her voice steady, betraying no sign of the anxiety that stirred beneath the surface. "We need to be smart. If we go too hard, Too fast, it could backfire. We need to regain control, not create more chaos. Dominic looked at her, a flicker of respect passing through his eyes. Exactly. That's why I need you in this. You think differently than I do, and that's what we need right now. The next few weeks were filled with clandestine meetings, late-night calls, and hours spent strategizing. Dominic and Angela had become an unstoppable force, but the challenges they faced were far from over. The organization was fractured, and rebuilding it would take more than just eliminating threats. It would take trust, loyalty, and a careful balance of power. Angela knew she could handle the task, but the question remained. Could she protect the man she had come to care for without losing herself in the process? As the tension in the mansion grew, Angela found herself drawn closer to Dominic, not just as a business partner, but as someone who had become more important to her than she had initially allowed herself to admit. Dominic, for all his power and control, was no different from anyone else. He had fears, doubts, and weaknesses, and Angela had come to realize that it wasn't just his empire she was fighting for. It was him. But as their connection deepened, so did the danger they faced. There were still people in the organization who would stop at nothing to tear them apart. And with every step they took to secure their position, they attracted more enemies. One evening, as Angela was reviewing some financial documents, a sharp knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. It was Luca, Dominic's head of security. "There's someone you need to see," he said, his face grim. "It's about the deal we've been working on." Angela stood up, her heart racing. She followed Luca down the hallway, her mind already calculating what new threat awaited them. They entered Dominic's office to find him on the phone, his face tense. When he saw Angela, he hung up the phone and turned to her. "We've got a problem," he said simply. Angela's stomach dropped. "What is it?" Dominic handed her a file, and as she flipped through the papers, her eyes narrowed. "They're planning something big," she said, her voice sharp. "A coordinated strike. We need to act now before they make their move." Dominic nodded, his expression hardening. "Get the team together. We strike first." As Angela left his office to prepare for the upcoming confrontation, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. They had always known this fight would be difficult, but now, it was personal. Dominic had made it clear that this was a battle for their lives, for the empire they had built together. And Angela knew that this time, there was no room for mistakes. They had crossed the point of no return, and the only option now was to win or lose everything. The tension in the mansion was unbearable. Dominic and Angela had been preparing for the strike against their enemies, but things had escalated faster than they could have imagined. They had planned every move carefully, yet the moment had come sooner than expected. The coordinated strike, planned by those who sought to tear down what Dominic had built, was happening right now. Angela could feel the weight of their decisions pressing down on her. This wasn't just about power anymore. This was about survival. Dominic had always been the one to take charge, but now, the fate of everything they had worked for rested on both of them. They had fought through countless battles together, but this time, it felt different. This was personal. Angela stood beside Dominic, the weight of their plan in the air as they prepared to move. He turned to her, his eyes sharp and filled with determination. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. Angela nodded, her face a mask of calm, but inside, her heart raced. "We need to move quickly. They're already on the move," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "Let's hit them hard and fast. We can't give them a chance to regroup." Dominic met her gaze, his respect for her unwavering. "You're right. We can't afford to wait." With that, the two of them moved swiftly, coordinating their strike with precision. The mansion buzzed with activity as Dominic's trusted team took their positions, while Angela oversaw the operations from the command center. She had always been a quiet observer, but now, her strategic mind was at the forefront of everything they did. They worked like a well-oiled machine, communicating through signals and hand gestures, never wasting a moment. The night stretched on as they dismantled their enemies' plans piece by piece. But even as their attack moved forward, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had seen it in their eyes, the people who had once called themselves allies. They were scared. They were scrambling. And in their desperation, they were dangerous. Just as they were about to secure the final location, an unexpected wave of resistance hit them. Angela felt the tension in the air shift, and within seconds, the situation changed. Dominic's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Stay focused," he shouted over the comms. "We've come too far to fail now." Angela's heart raced as she looked around the room. Everything had been going according to plan, until now. Someone was leaking information. Someone inside their own ranks had betrayed them. She turned to Dominic, her gaze intense. "There's a leak," she said, her voice low. "We can't trust anyone in this room." Dominic's expression hardened. "I know. We'll deal with it later. Right now, we finish what we started." And so they did. They pushed forward, fighting through the final lines of resistance with calculated precision. By the time the night was over, the enemies who had once threatened to tear their world apart were scattered, defeated. The mansion stood tall once again, but the victory felt hollow. They had won, but at what cost? The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. Dominic and Angela stood in the quiet aftermath, the adrenaline of the night still coursing through their veins. The realization of how close they had come to losing everything began to settle in. But despite the chaos, despite the danger, there was something else, something deeper. Their bond had been tested, and it had survived. They had faced the storm together and come out on the other side stronger. "We did it," Angela said quietly, her voice steady but filled with exhaustion. Dominic turned to her, his gaze intense. "No," he replied, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We didn't just do it. We changed the game." They both knew it was true. The landscape had shifted. Their enemies were defeated, but new challenges loomed on the horizon. The battle for control, the fight for their place in the world, was far from over. But for the first time, they both knew they had something stronger than power. They had each other. As they stood there, in the quiet aftermath of the battle, they knew that they were ready for whatever came next. Together, they would face the future, whatever it held. In the aftermath of their victory, Dominic and Angela stood at the precipice of a new chapter. Their enemies had been defeated, but the world they had fought so hard to control was shifting, and they both knew it. What they had just endured was not the end. It was merely the beginning of a new battle, one that would test their resolve in ways they had never imagined. The mansion, once again quiet after the chaos of the past weeks, now felt like a fortress, but it was a fortress built on fragile ground. The people who had tried to tear their world apart were gone, but there were always others waiting in the shadows. Angela knew this. She had learned this lesson too well. But she also knew that she wasn't alone anymore. She had Dominic by her side, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of purpose and clarity. As the days passed, their bond grew stronger. They had been through fire together, and they had come out of it unscathed. But the work was far from over. They spent hours in meetings, strategizing, securing alliances, and laying the foundation for the empire that was theirs to build. Dominic's trust in Angela had solidified, and she had earned her place beside him, not as a subordinate, but as an equal. She had proven herself time and time again, and now, with the full weight of the organization behind them, they were unstoppable. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Dominic and Angela stood together on the balcony of the mansion. The world below them was a maze of lights, of power, of possibility. Dominic looked over at Angela, his expression softening as he spoke. "You've changed everything," he said quietly, his voice filled with admiration. Angela looked at him, her gaze steady, her heart full. "We changed everything," she corrected him gently. Dominic smiled, the first true smile she had seen from him in a long time. It was a smile that spoke of trust, of respect, and of a partnership that had been forged in the fire of adversity. "You're right," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "We did. And together, we'll keep changing things. For the better." Angela nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. She had come so far from the woman who once cleaned the floors of this mansion. She had proven her worth, and she had earned Dominic's trust. But more than that, she had earned her place in this world, a world she had once only observed from the shadows. As they stood there, side by side, the weight of their journey and the promise of the future seemed to hang in the air between them. They were no longer just allies. They were a team, a force to be reckoned with, and nothing could stand in their way. Dominic placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. "This is just the beginning, Angela," he said softly. "There's so much more to come, and I'm glad you'll be with me every step of the way." Angela turned to face him, her heart swelling with emotion. "I wouldn't have it any other way," she said, her voice steady and sure. As the night stretched on and the city below them buzzed with life, Dominic and Angela stood together, not as a boss and his maid, not as employer and employee, but as partners, equals in every sense of the word. They had survived the storms, faced betrayal, and emerged victorious. Now, they had only one thing left to do: build the future they both wanted, one step at a time. And as they looked out over the city, they knew that they had the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they were unstoppable. The future was theirs for the taking, and they would shape it with their own hands.